One of my very favorite things that I like to do as an attorney, an employment lawyer, for employees is help employees fight their performance improvement plans, known by the acronym of PIP. Fighting PIPs are really important, and I truly enjoy this aspect of my law practice. There's a couple things you need to know about fighting PIPs. The first one is you have to ask yourself, why are you on a PIP? Now, there will be one of two answers. Answer A is you're lousy at your job. Answer B is you're good at your job. They want to fire you. Now, how is it that we determine the reason that you're on the PIP? Well, there are a number of factors that we look to. One of the most important ones is longevity of a career, of a profession, of a field that you may be in. For example, last year I had the wonderful pleasure of representing an IRS employee in Utah, and she was a successful auditor for 32 years. And within weeks of complaining about age discrimination, all of a sudden, she was put on a PIP. That, to me, indicated, and we ultimately settled that case a week before trial when the government knew it was going to lose. But ultimately, that was a huge factor in, hey, if she's been doing this job for 32 years, you never had a problem with any of the work she was doing. Why now? Why is she a lousy auditor? And it turned out, obviously, she wasn't. The second big factor is what kind of notice or warning did you as the employee get that a PIP was coming? Now, if you're a federal employee, the federal government's supposed to, by regulation, give you notice of the individual deficiencies of your job, and they generally do that with your employment year-end, September 30th evaluation, because that's when the year ends for the federal government anyway, for issues like this. Or they can do it in other ways, in your PMAP or something like that. But at the end of the day, you have to have notice of these deficiencies. If you didn't get notice, meaning all of a sudden they hit you the day your evaluation came out, the federal government hit you and said, by the way, this year you are deficient in job element A, B, and C, and we're putting you on a PIP, very, very suspicious, and you have to fight the PIP. Okay, so that's number one. The question now is, you've gotten the PIP. How do you succeed at a PIP? Because most people don't. Certainly in the private sector or in the government, if the aim of the PIP in the first place is to get rid of you, then pretty much it would follow that most people do not survive these PIPs. But you can. And one thing you're going to absolutely have to do is get an attorney to be your advocate and to be your consultant, so to speak, at the way beginning of the PIP. As soon as you find out you're on a PIP, you should call an employment lawyer who has experience in this field, because your lawyer's experience in dealing with these PIPs is most likely going to be the number one factor that's going to help you overcome the PIP. And one of the things that I've done, and I continue to do on these PIPs, is I study with the client what the employer is up to and how we can diagnose and stop the underhanded techniques that are used here by the employer to make it look like you have actually failed the PIP. One thing, with the PIP, and federal employees are supposed to have weekly meetings with the person, the supervisor or whomever that has told you that you suck at your job. And you have to meet with this person and you go over what the weekly criticisms were and how quote unquote you've been deficient and whether you are improving. A lot of times the supervisor doesn't even show up to these weekly meetings, and they kind of leave you in the lurch of what am I supposed to do? There's nobody here to talk to. I don't know if I'm improving. And this is a common theme in employment law. Your employer is counting on weakness from you. The employer is counting on the fact that you are not going to have the gumption, the aptitude, the motivation, or interest, or hopefulness in fighting this. And you can't let that happen. You really have to show these people that you're ready for this from day one, particularly on these PIPs. So that's the first aspect, is if someone doesn't show up to the weekly meetings, point that out. Keep a journal. How many times were these weekly meetings not held? How many times did the supervisor say, you can come to my office and you can pick my brain and I'm here for you, and all this other junk, and you went there and the supervisor treated you like absolute dog do? I mean, that happens. You have to keep a journal about that. You have to let your attorney know. We have people on PIPs, and they keep almost a daily or a couple times a week at least email correspondence with us of just letting us know what the play-by-play was of the next moves of the PIP so that we can fight them. Right, that's number one. Now, keep in mind, you're not going to tell your employer you have a lawyer. This is all behind-the-scenes ghostwriting. They all think this is coming from you, which makes this even more intimidating than it is, because they've never seen this before and they don't quite know how to deal with a really well-prepared employee like you who's going to call these people on the carpet for the things that aren't true. Now, there are other things that the employers will do to try to screw you on your PIP, like they will add duties to your job out of the blue, and you will have to learn those duties right in the middle of the PIP. And because there's usually a learning curve whenever anyone learns a new job skill, that is something that the employer can say, hey, this guy was lousy on his job, and this is further evidence that he or she should have been fired. Number two, another thing they do is they just flat out make up deficiencies about you. They make up deficiencies during the PIP period itself, but not in the period leading up to the PIP, which they're not allowed to do. They have to focus on the original issues that were deficient that supposedly you were lousy at. Another thing they do, when they put you on the PIP and they tell you why you're on the PIP, they give very vague and generic performance issues. They don't provide in any specific detail that which it is that you supposedly suck at. And that's something they make it so that it's really, really hard to fight. They want to intimidate you into believing that it's just hopeless for me to challenge my supervisor on this, because they have the upper hand, and what they're going to do is they're always going to come up with some sort of something that says I'm in the wrong and they're right. And they don't understand, and you don't understand at the time, that if they blow this, if your employer screws this PIP up, all right, as the IRS did in Utah, you will win a lot of money. So you have to understand that, and that's why you have to follow these things as they come up. Another thing they do is they increase your workload. They make it so that it becomes impossible to achieve this newfound federal agency productivity demand. Be on the lookout of that. There are factors beyond your control that you get blamed for. For example, the company lost some big accounts, and you're on a PIP because you're quote-unquote not making your numbers. Well, you have to think about that. How could I make my numbers if the company lost big accounts? Why am I on a PIP for this? You have to challenge that. Another thing they do to you is they single you out for a deficient team. Maybe you're in part of a unit, in a component, a team. However you classify it, you're one person out of 5 working on this project, but you're the one on the PIP. Nobody else was. So these are some of the keys that happen with the PIPs, and I'm going to read a letter here, a short letter. Of course, I'm leaving out the names, but I actually wrote this for a client who was in the middle of a PIP, who challenged the PIP, obviously, and I wrote this. And here's what it was. Dear Mr. Supervisor, sends this by email. I note that we were supposed to have a PIP meeting sometime last week. However, I never heard from you about scheduling one. As you know, these meetings are very important to monitor employee self-improvement. My schedule is open for the rest of the week, and I hope to hear from you soon as these meetings benefit both us and the agency. Many thanks. Okay? I can tell you, when after the supervisor got 3 or 4 of these, ghost written by me, along with 3 or 4 other emails summarizing what happened at this PIP meeting when there was one, why what the employer said was totally not true. After around 3 or 4 of those, and somewhere around 45 days or so, the employer threw in the towel and told my client that, we didn't really need to put you on a PIP anymore, and that's it. Now, one other thing you should know is if you complain about discrimination or you try to get a reasonable accommodation for disability, and within weeks or a few months you're placed on a PIP as a result of that, even if you pass the PIP, even if they ultimately conclude you shouldn't have been on a PIP, and at least in Washington, D.C., you can sue on that. That's a retaliatory action. There's case law that supports one's ability to obtain compensatory damages for the pain and suffering of having to go through this crap. So I will conclude with this. The PIP is a double-edged sword, okay? It's double-edged for your employer. It's double-edged for you. If it's handled well, the side that handles the PIP the best will ultimately win the PIP action. And if you have a lawyer who's experienced in winning these actions and helping employees survive and even get compensation on these PIPs, you will substantially increase your ability to turn the PIP into an advantage for you.